Esta pregunta es respecto al panel 2 de la exposición. El panel, como saben, está señalado por el cuadrado que está en la esquina superior izquierda, donde en este panel 2 de la exposición se representa una serie de acontecimientos históricos sobre la genealogía de la casa inglesa. Esto se realiza a través de esquematizaciones de casas típicas agrupadas según la composición y posición del hall intermedio, de middle hall, el término que hemos elegido en inglés, y la integración entre sus partes. John, por favor, coméntanos esta genealogía basada en el hall intermedio, su análisis y representación gráfica. Tienes la palabra.
Thank you, Andres. I think it's really interesting in this abstraction of the typology of the hall and how it evolves that you can see the way the examples have been selected. You can see how a particular idea can be shown to evolve within English houses. Now, that evolution strikes me as absolutely clear in the way it's been presented. But on the ground, I think there's a lot more going on in English houses over this period than this particular selection of images shows. I think it's true to say that when you visit a medieval house or are looking at the archaeological remains of a medieval building, one of the things you're always trying to do is identify the hall. Now, the hall, in very simple terms, in a medieval house is simply the biggest interior within it. In English architecture, the hall is indeed a sort of defining element of a great medieval house. And it has its origins, as this exhibition describes, in Anglo-Saxon architecture, in really the post-Roman period in England. But in recognizing halls, I think it's important to understand that architectural historians, particularly in the 19th century, which is critical for what this exhibition is looking at, tried to impose a logic on the evolution of this building. And they really projected backwards from the 14th, 15th, and 16th century a development of the hall, which I think is imagined rather than real. We do have in English houses these great buildings, and they are these great interiors, and they are often entered at one side, one of the long sides of the interior. Some of the elements which you find in the houses represented here, as in Penshurst or at Condover, they incorporate an internal screen that separates the doorway from the body of the hall. Now, the very earliest screens that actually exist are of the 14th century, and we don't really know whether halls actually had screens before that time. So that in itself is quite a late introduction to these buildings. The other thing I think that's very important to understand in relation to halls is that when we study them architecturally, what we're actually looking at is the architectural manifestation of a way of life. Halls are historically, in the Anglo-Saxon period, the place where the household, obviously great people, have many followers. It's where they eat and sleep. And in England, until the 17th century, the royal household and many great households fed their followers, and the hall was the place where that happened. But what's also happening in this period is that there are more and more rooms opening off halls where the household actually do their work, whether they're in the kitchens or whether they're looking after a nobleman or noblewoman in their apartments. And so what actually happens in the course of the Middle Ages is these ancient buildings have the life literally sucked out of them, but they are a focus for life within the household itself. So in a curious way, halls are symbolic interiors. They are the places where you eat, but they are representations in architecture of the greatness, the scale of a household. And very interestingly, they are also deliberately archaic in their forms. So, for example, in England, from the 12th century, even the late 11th century, people have fireplaces in rooms. It's perfectly natural. You want to get the smoke out of the room. But in a hall, even until the 17th or 18th century, you commonly have central fireplaces. This is incredibly inconvenient. It doesn't work very well because all the smoke goes into the room. But that's what halls have. And they also, in an English context, have these great open timber roofs. this is a feature of halls, these two almost emblems of them, the central fireplace and the open timber roof. So these two features are the things that are really being played with, and also the scale of the room, which, as I say, is largely symbolic.
John, mi intervención es sobre, de nuevo, sobre la genealogía del panel 2 de la exposición. Me referiré a las razones básicas por las cuales fueron escogidas las casas de diferentes periodos de la historia de la arquitectura inglesa, que se esquematizaron de acuerdo a la composición y la posición del hall intermedio. Primero, la casa del siglo XI, a la que te referías ahora, que en su origen era una edificación unitaria con un hall único. Segundo, la casa del siglo XIV, que desarrolló la organización tripartita. Tercero, la casa tripartita del siglo XVI, cuya organización espacial colaboró en la definición del estilo Tudor. Cuarto, la casa del siglo XVII, que permaneció con estructura tripartita y presentó cambios estilísticos. Quinto, la casa que llega hasta el siglo XIX con los estilos Tudor Revival y Gothic Revival, donde el hall desaparece y reaparece con nuevos atributos. Y para finalizar mi intervención, la genealogía termina con la casa del siglo XIX y XX del movimiento Arts and Crafts, donde las partes del hall intermedio se integran. Doy paso a la intervención de Patricia.
Genealogy of the Middle Hall House. Throughout the history of the English house, and particularly between the 14th and 19th centuries, it is possible to identify the presence of a spatial structure that consists of three parts and a middle hall. The house schemes seen here show how the English house grew from its origin as a unitary building with a single hall in the 11th century. The Saxon house plan and the combined model of the Saxon and Norman houses illustrate this. The combined model could be seen in a T-shape or an H-shape disposition. It shows the hall in a middle position with one or two adjacent ends. This structure consolidated around the 14th century, both in large and smaller types of houses. Penshurst Place, built in the 14th century, stands out as an example of the large manor house, the dwelling of the lord of the manor, with its middle hall. Banquets, ceremonies, and celebrations were held in its great hall, where a new social class reveled in its economic and political power. The spatial structure of three parts and a middle hall allowed a careful and ordered experience of the internal spaces, which might explain why this organizational pattern became widely adopted in the building of large and smaller houses in the following centuries. For example, the plan was imitated by the smaller scale farmhouse of the Geoman, such as Bayleaf House, a timber-framed hall house dating from the early 15th century.
For participating with us. And I actually, there are a couple of points that you made in your initial comments, which will apply very nicely to the third part of today's session, the interpretations bit. And so I'll have an opportunity to come back to those then. There were two particular areas, and they're very different from each other, where what I thought I might ask you to relate to when you do your own summary. The first is a very straightforward one, which is, to what extent do you think that the houses that we presented and that you're seeing now on the screen are the ones that are representative of the points that the museum is trying to make? You'll have seen that the pattern is a very straightforward one. So Pondover, for example, it looks to us like a formalized version of a medieval hall house, because essentially it's doing a very similar role. It's just that it's doing it in a much more geometrical form, whereas Chattleton, is that how it's pronounced, Chattleton, or do they call it Castleton?
Castleton.
Castleton, they call it, do they? We've given that a formal classical name because the whole organisation of the plan is different. And I noticed also from looking at Mark Girouard's Elizabethan houses this morning that it's one of the plans that was drawn by John Thorpe as being an example of a kind of new type of modular planning. We go then to the Grange, which, although is an oddity, it's a very significant oddity, and then from then on to Bexton Croft, which is in Knutsford, as an example of an arts and crafts one. So the first point that I would make here is how relevant, how accurate, or how well do they do the job. The second point in my remaining 22 seconds is to say, pick you up on a point that you made, which there are many other factors involved, and I'd be interested to know whether you thought the architectural style of the houses related to the plan role of the house, or whether it's a different kind of development altogether. Oh, how about that? 1 second to go.
I suppose Tim's questions bubble first to mind. How typical are these as examples? Well, I think in honesty, they're more and more typical as time goes on. Penshurst is one of these extraordinary buildings that has fallen through time, seemingly, from the 1340s. But as a great hall, it is in fact very unusual for its period. In part, that's because nearly all major great halls prior to the mid-14th century in England are actually divided internally by arcades of arches. This is a legacy from the framing of great halls, so that historically, when you have these very high-pitched roofs, you need to have internal support for them. So it's really in this period that there are examples of earlier great halls that have a single span roof, but in fact it's quite clear that in many major great halls, even into the 15th and early 16th centuries, you do still have internal arcades of arches supporting the roof, and they're a principal feature of the interior. Now, historically, in the 19th century, when people were looking back at this material, they were perfectly aware of this, but the halls that survived, I think, tended to be things that they were under single span roofs, and that was what they were really interested in reviving. I think another very important point to make is that over the course of the Middle Ages and in the 14th century, which is when this story that you're telling begins, there is an extraordinary transformation taking place in the grand scale of domestic architecture. And that's a shift from having buildings that are predominantly of timber, in timber frame, to buildings that are predominantly of stone. And in royal palaces, until the very end of the 13th century, it's still very common to have buildings as timber frame buildings. That many great houses thereafter tend to have some stone buildings and some timber buildings. Now, the problem with timber buildings is when they no longer exist, or when, with the passage of time, it's very easy to simply overlook evidence for their existence. And the architectural history of domestic architecture in the Middle Ages has generally been written from the example of masonry buildings. They just survive better. So I think it's very easy, I think, to misunderstand what you're actually looking at in medieval buildings. Now, just coming back to say that from the 14th century, I think things become more consistent, and the examples that you've given are, as it were, more typical. As I've said, halls are they become almost a stylized building type. They're large interiors with grand open timber roofs, entered at one extreme through a screened passage, and usually with a central hearth. And so that becomes almost the architectural language of halls, and they become, in fact, very consistent in form. And that consistency in the late 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries is one reason, I think, why architectural historians assumed that halls had always looked the way that they were familiar with seeing them. They tend to be single span spaces with all these different elements incorporated into them. So I think the selection you've made does become more accurate as you go through time. Again, I think it's a very formalist way of looking at these things, and I think that the in fact, maybe we're going to talk about this in the next segment, but what's so interesting is I think the 19th century and the 20th century use of halls is in fact in many ways completely contrary to their historic use throughout the Middle Ages. So if you imagine, halls as a building type with the place where the household eats and originally no doubt sleeps too, and that during the course of the Middle Ages, people are being sucked out of the hall to do their jobs at both ends, both in the kitchens and the services, and also in the smart rooms at the other end of the house. And the hall becomes a kind of carcass. It's a room that doesn't really have very many functions, but it's symbolic of the household and of the values of the household, of community, of scale, of grandeur and wealth. And its architectural forms are very stylized, such as having a central fireplace, very archaic idea. It's quite difficult to think of other building types that have been treated in the same way, but I mean, arguably a church is one. You kind of generally design new churches within a particular idiom so that you still recognize them as church buildings. There were more questions. I can't now entirely remember, Tim. There was another question.
Yeah, about style, John, about whether the scale and the location of some of these later halls was as much to do with an aesthetic style as it was to do with anything else. You think of the contrast, for example, between Pugins Grange and any of them, Castleton, really.
Yes, well, I mean, I certainly think that, of course, the popularity of these buildings is bound up in the late 19th and 20th century with the Gothic revival and the battle of the styles and the desire to create an architecture that is drawn from the historic past, and particularly from an English historic past. So I think that the hall is in a way a romantic there is a romantic revival in the hall itself as a building type, and that the style is very important in that revival because it is an evocation of a period of building that is being revived more widely at that time.